Chapter 2. Are Earthquakes Coming? It has all happened so quickly, so unexpectedly. It began only 3 weeks ago, but since then, the changes have been so great, and the world that we used to know is only a memory. Looking back, we should have seen the signs that all this was coming. Just the frequency with which the earth was rumbling should have alerted us. 2 months ago, there were strong earthquakes in the Mediterranean Sea area. There were some minor eruptions of Mount Etna, and then Mount Pelee, which had been quiet for so long, violently erupted. Yet, who would have expected that those signs were an overture to the cataclysms that have followed? 3 weeks ago, on a sunny October morning, in the middle of rush hour traffic, the land began to shake in California. Not the small tremors that these people had come to expect and live with. Instead, it was an earthquake of unprecedented intensity and duration. The loss of life and property was so severe that it will be difficult ever to make a count. Portions of what had been dry land that morning are now permanently submerged under more than 50 feet of ocean water. But things did not stop with California. In the past 3 weeks, there have come reports from around the world of severe earth changes, devastating earthquakes and tidal waves in Japan, tremors of record intensity in Turkey and Armenia. There have been strong earthquakes in northern Europe, although as yet there has been no loss of life there. The nation and the world have not yet begun to deal with the effects of what has already happened. In the months to come, those of us who have not been directly affected will quickly come to realize how interconnected the world is. The unavailability of food and industrial goods will soon be painfully noticeable. And everywhere, there is the rarely spoken fear. What if we have seen so far is just the beginning? This scenario is from the imagination of someone who has read the prophecies of Earth changes found in the Edgar Cayce readings. Probably every person who has studied this material has created his or her own story of what it would be like to live in a world whose geography was rapidly and violently changing for most of us. It is a sobering and anxiety-producing exercise. In many ways, the readings that Cayce gave on Earth changes have done more to popularize his name than any other part of his work. There is without a doubt a sensational quality to the idea of California going into the sea, or a once dormant volcano reawakening with a fury. It's the kind of sensational material that sells magazine articles and books. It often seems a shame that so many people know of Edgar Cayce in terms of his visions of a possible Earth catastrophe, rather than for his quiet, humble work of helping individuals with physical healing or finding deeper purpose in life. Perhaps because of the dramatic quality of these few readings on Earth changes, they have been frequently misstated and misinterpreted. Perhaps it's fear that causes a person, even unconsciously, to alter slightly one of Cayce's prophecies. Or perhaps there are those who are so frustrated with the way our world is run that they take pleasure in misrepresenting Cayce's prophecies, which suggests widespread destruction. A truly outlandish example of such sensationalism took place in December 1994, when the tabloid newspaper Weekly World News ran on its cover a picture of Edgar Cayce and the headline, "Secret Predictions of America's Greatest Prophet." It went on to claim that in 1945, Case recorded in his personal diary a list of never-before-published prophecies. The only problem with this claim is that Case ceased giving readings in 1944 and died on January 3, 1945. The bogus list includes ominous statements, completely disconnected from the authentic Case Millennium prophecies. Which Case readings addressed Earth changes? In studying the details of the Case Millennium prophecy, we should keep in mind that the 24 psychic readings that produce specific Earth change predictions are only 0.2% of all the readings he gave in his 43-year career. The other readings, more than 14,000 of them, were for people with health problems, individuals looking for greater purpose in life, and those seeking spiritual guidance. Even though the vast majority of the Case readings don't directly concern Earth changes, most of them do indirectly. How can this be? Many of the people getting these readings were starting to feel the strains and ambiguities of a world of accelerating change. Sometimes their health problems were principally stress-induced. Often, their confusion about finding meaningful work was the result of a world already beginning to change dramatically. Frequently, their spiritual disorientation was due to the same moral dilemmas and ethical challenges that we experience so acutely today. The more than 99% of Case's work that some people have dismissed as irrelevant to the Case prophecies is, in fact, a part of the whole picture. It contains his worldview, and it provides a backdrop against which we can see and understand the more sensational predictions. To look exclusively at those 24 readings and mention earthquakes, volcanoes, and tidal waves would be to miss the grander portrait that Case has painted about the transition into a new millennium. When we examine the Case teachings as a whole, then we discover the great purposefulness that stands behind the Earth changes that may be coming. The Case prophecies can help us shape our beliefs about the future, but for them to be most effective in doing this, we've got to look at the whole of what he stated about changing times. Too often there have been pieces of predictions published or quoted in lectures. These fragments can easily create a distorted picture, sometimes serving to stimulate fear. Probably no other portion of the Edgar Case material has been more misquoted and misunderstood than his statements about the landmass changes that might accompany the beginning of a new millennium. As already noted, when compared to the immense volume of readings he gave, these predictions of earthquakes, volcanoes, and tidal waves are almost insignificant in number, and yet no other readings have had such an impact on the thinking of people who are familiar with his work. These particular readings are so easily misunderstood because they are often studied improperly and, to make matters worse, are frequently quoted out of context. Rarely does one see a chronological examination of what he said on this topic. In the few instances in which timing has been considered, the prophecies are presented in order in which we can expect to see them materialize. For example, predictions about the year 1936 before predictions about the years 1958 to 1998. However, what if Case gave some of his prophecies about 1936 after he gave the ones for 1958 to 1998? If we are really to experience prophecy as an unfolding, dynamic phenomenon, then the best study would be to recreate for ourselves what it would have been like to be with Edgar Case between 1926 and 1944, And to hear these predictions being made and sometimes changing over the years, that is the approach that we will use in this chapter. The majority of the case prophecies have not yet proved to be right or wrong. The predictions yet to be fulfilled fall into two primary categories: geophysical, earth changes, and political, economic prophecies. This chapter will consider each prediction of geophysical change. The prophecies concerning social change and the destiny of the nations will be addressed in the next chapter: the new root race and a new world order. Of course, most of us aren't very knowledgeable about seismology, the scientific investigation of earth changes. In my own research of the case Millennium prophecies, I found it very useful to engage a professional geologist to help me understand and interpret Case's predictions about cataclysmic changes, and to relearn what I had been taught about earth science in high school. Material I had since forgotten. The details of what I rediscovered and what I newly learned from the geologist are found in Chapter 5. Those facts will help us comprehend what Case may have been seeing clairvoyantly about the planet. But first, let's look at the Earth change prediction themselves. A chronological study of the Earth change predictions. Our examination of the Earth changes readings in the sequence given by Case begins with the year 1926. Before this date, we find no reference to major geological upheaval. In other words, Case had been giving readings for more than 20 years before this topic even came up. In 1926, a man in his early 40s asked Case for a series of readings on the topic of long-range weather forecasting. At the end of the second reading, Case offered some additional information on weather conditions and the effects they would soon have. He noted that there was a close relationship between these climatic conditions and human affairs. Astrological influences would also play a role. There would be a particular strong sway by Jupiter and Uranus for a 6-day period between October 15 and 20. Significant changes could be expected then. These changes would be seen in the minds and the deeds of individuals. And on a global level, some of the changes would be constructive, others destructive. But Case seemed to envision things that were bound to go beyond just this 6-day period. In human affairs, unusual conditions would arise. They would be felt in religion, politics, and the social dimension of life, especially in regard to morals and values. Then he cited one example: prohibition, i.e., regarding the sale of alcoholic beverages, would be overturned in America. In the final part of this prophecy, he turns his attention back to the weather and adds certain geological predictions. Several violent windstorms will be seen soon, and there will be 2 earthquakes, one in Southern California and the other in Japan. Tidal waves will follow the Japanese one, with one especially affecting islands to the south of Japan. This 1926 prediction about prohibition was fulfilled. The laws banning alcohol had been approved by Congress in 1919. Historians point to a date somewhat after 1926 when a groundswell of public opinion began to move against prohibition. It was 1933 before the laws were repealed, but Case had accurately perceived this coming shift in the moral attitude of Americans. What do the records show about the accuracy of the rest of these predictions? They're not very supportive. This 1926 prophecy must be viewed as essentially one that failed to materialize, or at least the earth changes portions of it. There was no significant earthquake or tidal wave in Japan on those dates. A moderate quake hit California on October 22, 1926, 2 days beyond the predicted dates. However, it was hardly of the magnitude that we might have expected, considering the fact that Case had gone out of his way to bring it up. Earthquakes of equal intensity were happening about every 2 months in California. There were quakes of about the same strength on July 25th, 1926, and January 1st, 1927. After the 1926 reading, 6 years passed before we again find someone asking Case about earth changes. In 1932, a 30-year-old man questioned him carefully about the details of what might happen if severe geological changes were to take place. Case gave him 3 separate earth change readings in 1932, spaced about 4 months apart. Among these readings are some interesting predictions about the order in which events are to take place. First, Case indicated certain signs to watch for which would signal the beginning of the times of great earth change activity. One indicator would be the breaking up of lands in the South Pacific. He states that the changes here could include either sinking or rising. This suggests that we should watch either for island areas hit by earthquakes causing permanent inundation, or for geological shifts that cause South Pacific land areas to rise even higher above sea level. Another signal event named by Case is to take place at a spot almost exactly opposite on the globe, in the Mediterranean Sea, possibly an eruption of Mount Etna on the island of Sicily. When asked when to expect such indicators, Case answered that, seen from one perspective, these signs had already begun. However, it would likely be 1936 when such changes would be clearly apparent. Then he was asked whether this would trigger earth changes that would affect North America. His answer was a clear warning of the possibility of severe destruction. All over the country there might come minor and major shifts, but directly targeted was the North Atlantic seaboard, with New York and Connecticut specifically named. The man who received these readings apparently had a strong personal interest in the fate of Alabama because he asked directly about this area. Case predicted that there would be changes there, affecting the northwestern and the extreme southwestern parts of the state, but not until after the ones he had previously described. The timetable he suggested was between 1936 and 1938. However, he made it clear that the changes would be gradual rather than sudden. Finally, the questioner asked about Norfolk, Virginia, and its vicinity. Case's own home area. The prophecy was that changes would come to this area too, but those were much farther away, some 20 years after the ones he foresaw for the North Atlantic seaboard and for Alabama. We're left to wonder how we should take this set of predictions. Obviously, nothing of the scope he mentioned here in 1932 took place in the period from 1936 to 1938. Has the timing simply been delayed? Does the warning sign related to the South Pacific and Mount Etna still hold? Most scholars of the Case material take the position that Case was able to see specific interconnecting conditions beneath the Earth's surface, and even if the timing was wrong, the same series of warning events is still relevant. In the next important series of predictions, Case became even more specific. These readings from early 1933 through 1936 were given to a man in his late 40s who lived in San Francisco. There is a strong sense of the unfolding, dynamic quality of prophecy in these passages. The predictions start to change as the months go by, and Case is asked repeatedly about the fate of San Francisco. Case began in February 1933, sounding quite sure that in 1936 there would be a major destruction of San Francisco. He couldn't have been more blunt. When asked to compare this coming quake to the famous one in 1906, he said, "This will be a baby beside what it'll be in 36. By mid-1934, he was less inclined to specify dates. The same questioner had come back and wanted more details about 1936. He wondered if the predicted Earth changes were so fixed and predetermined that Case could clairvoyantly describe the Pacific coastline of America after the earthquakes. Now Case seemed to back away from any specific chronology, while still affirming that earthquakes in this area were due, and that it was written in the cosmic scheme of things that they would happen at some point. But even more significant, Case stated that was to transpire depended upon the attitudes of individuals and groups, something so important to Case's prophecies about changing times that we'll look at it much more closely in chapters 7 and 8. Of course, this is a radical idea that has no place in mainstream geology. The notion that human psychology or daily behavior, short of rash acts such as detonating underground nuclear explosions, could affect earthquakes seems like nonsense to the typical Earth scientist. By June 1936, he had backed away from his San Francisco prediction for that year, stating that he no longer saw any great material damage coming to that city for the coming year. However, he went on to predict that there would be some major earthquake activity in areas to the east and to the south of San Francisco, places where there had not been previous damage. He then went on to give more details about the factors that affect earthquakes, in addition to the obvious geological ingredients, internal movements of the earth, and to the more esoteric influence of people's thoughts and deeds. He added something else: astrological influences. He asserted that Earth changes are impelled at least partially by planets and stars in relationship to the Earth. Next came one of his most famous prophecies concerning the west coast of America, of a warning sign for which people could be alert. Significant eruptions at one of the two volcanoes would be the sign. Either Mount Vesuvius on the island of Sicily or Mount Pelée on the island of Martinique in the West Indies. If either were to take place, then within 3 months severe flooding would be widespread as a result of major earthquakes. The areas specifically mentioned were the southern coast of California, plus the areas between Salt Lake and the southern portions of Nevada. Much has been made of this prediction in the decades since it was given, stretching the truth of the matter. Some people have claimed that Case predicted California falling into the ocean. Various coastline maps purported to be based on the Case predictions show the vast amounts of North America gone, with the Pacific coming in to Utah or even farther east. What's more, there has been considerable misunderstanding about the warning. The reading clearly predicts that the major flooding would occur within 3 months of the eruption. It does not say, as many have misquoted, that once Mount Vesuvius or Mount Pelée erupts in a major way, then California residents have a 3-month safety or grace period in which to sell their houses and get out. Finally, the series of Earth change predictions from June 1936 concludes with this prophecy: there will be greater seismic upheavals in the southern hemisphere than in the northern. Earlier predictions indicated that the Earth changes would be a worldwide phenomenon, not just something confined to America, because many more specific references to catastrophic changes point to America than to other countries. Some people have mistakenly believed that Case predicted America would be hardest hit. Others have gone so far as to believe that Case implicitly suggested that America is especially deserving of punishment. However, this unambiguous prophecy about the southern hemisphere puts that mistaken notion to rest. In fact, there is a more plausible and very simple reason that the majority of Case's predictions concern changes occurring in America. The people receiving the readings were most often Americans and were naturally more inclined to ask about their own part of the world. People from Alabama worried about what would happen to Alabama. People from San Francisco about that city. Case generally met people at the level of their own concerns. So naturally, we have a majority of predictions about earthquakes and flooding in America. But this frequency shouldn't give us a distorted view of his vision of the global scope of these changes. In fact, the most international of the prophecies was given in 1934 in one of the so-called world affairs readings. These were readings given about political, economic, and sociological factors for the world as a whole. Some of Case's most important prophecies are found in this series. Both prophecies about earthquakes and predictions about changing human affairs. In January 1934, Case gave the 15th reading in this series. Here he made it clear that the coming earth changes would be spread throughout the world. In fact, this set of earth change prophecies has become the most often quoted portion among all his predictions. In this set of visionary statements, he was clearly speaking about a 40-year time span between 1958 and 1998 as marking the beginning of the changes he listed. This point has often been missed in articles and books about Case's prophecies. The readings do not say that all of the changes will be accomplished by 1998. Rather, that the 40-year endings in 1998 encompass the beginning of major global upheavals. He might well expect them to continue into the 21st century. Here are the specific predictions for world changes prophesied to commence in the 40 years between 1958 and 1998. 1. There will be a breaking up of the landmass of the western portion of America. The larger parts of Japan will go into the sea. There will be certain changes to the northern parts of Europe that will happen so quickly that it might be called in the twinkling of an eye. Lands will rise up out of the Atlantic Ocean off the east coast of America. Major upheavals will hit the Arctic and Antarctica. Volcanoes will erupt, especially in the tropics. A shifting of the poles will alter climatic conditions. For example, certain frigid and semi-tropical areas will become tropical. In that same reading, he was asked more specifically to make predictions for world changes that very year, 1934. Although he clearly missed the mark with many of the statements, many scholars of Case's work agree with parapsychologists who point out that precognition or prophecy is the most difficult form of psychic ability. Predictions require the seer to operate in a dimension of consciousness that is beyond the normal constraints of time and space, but then to articulate his visions in terms of a specific time frame. We'll address in Chapter 8 some of the factors that may have come into play when Case's Millennium prophecies failed to materialize by the date he stated. For now, let's consider these prophecies from reading 57:49 to 15, even though they may not have happened when Case said they were most likely to take place. Open waters will appear in the northern portion of Greenland, presumably another effect of climatic alterations. The new lands arising from the Atlantic will more specifically be located in the Caribbean Sea area. South America will be shaken from the uppermost portion to the end. In the Antarctic region, new land will arise off Tierra del Fuego. Several of these Earth changes predictions seem to relate directly to Case's vision of a pole shift. This is a frightening notion if it's taken at face value. The destruction that might come from a shift in the rotational axis of the Earth would be immense. Of course, some interpreters of the Case Millennium prophecies have suggested that his visions were in this case symbolic or metaphorical, references to the worldwide humanity getting a new orientation or set of values. But the fact remains that the pole shift prophecy, given more than once by Case, is stated as a literal event to come, and in one prophetic reading he offers a specific time frame. When asked what changes would happen in 2000 or 2001, he answered, "There is a shifting of the pole, or a new cycle begins. 2 final readings in our chronological sequence are especially significant. Both were given in the later years of Case's work. The first, given in 1939, was mentioned in Chapter 1. A woman who had studied the 300-year-old prophecies of Jacob Boehme asked Case to comment on what was coming. Case's prophetic reading for her contains important statements concerning the intensity of the millennium changes. In 1998, we will find a great deal of activity that has been created by the gradual changes that are coming about. As to the changes, the change between the Piscean and the Aquarian age is a gradual, not a cataclysmic one. So this gives a somewhat different angle on the future than some of the other Case millennium prophecies may have implied. This set of predictions among the last one, given by Case, minimized the likelihood of a cataclysmic future. Instead, these millennium prophecies offered in 1939 present the image of an Earth that will undergo gradual alterations, rather than an apocalyptic transition from the so-called Piscean age to an Aquarian era. Possibilities exist for a more piecemeal change, even though that gradual scenario still includes dramatic events. An apparent discrepancy exists between some cataclysmic prophecies and other predictions that sound more gradual. The topic will be addressed more fully in Chapter 5. The final important Earth change predictions came in 1941 to a woman in her mid-60s. Very detailed descriptions were offered of the future map of American. Here again, Case's timing seems to be off, because phrases such as "in the next few years" suggest that at least some of these changes would have happened by now. However, the enumeration of those changes was preceded by the words, "Changes here are gradually coming about," which suggests that these events may take a while to unfold. In summary, here is what Case presented in his final millennium prophecy reading about Earth's changes. Geographic alterations are coming for most of America. They will be experienced especially along the 2 coasts, but also in the central part of America. New land will appear up out of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Other coastal areas that are currently dry land will become the bed of the ocean. These inundations won't be limited to America. Some of the battlefields of World War II, going on as this reading was given, will eventually be submerged places. Affected portions of the East Coast will include the New York City area. However, this will not happen as soon as many of these other changes, and will rather be in some other generation. Much sooner than the changes along the northern Atlantic seacoast will be alterations along the South Atlantic. Portions of the Carolinas and Georgia will become permanently submerged. The drainage basin for North Central America will be altered so that waters from the Great Lakes will empty into the Mississippi River Basin and into the Gulf of Mexico, rather than via the St. Lawrence River. Severe changes for Los Angeles and San Francisco will happen well before any changes coming for New York. Certain safety lands exist, places less vulnerable to the coming changes. Among these safety lands of North America are southeastern Virginia. Virginia Beach, where Case's own readings had instructed him to move in the early 1920s for reasons more complex than just potential earth changes. Portions of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, much of the southern and the eastern portions of Canada. The notion of safety lands is a provocative one. It easily captures our imagination because it's natural to want a place of refuge when such global threat is predicted. However, we need to be very careful as we interpret this millennium prophecy from Case. He does not say that these are the only places that will be safe. But what if we could somehow identify all the locations that would be on such a list of places to be spared? Does that mean that we should all try to move to such a spot? Maybe that's not what Case meant. First, let's realize just how inconceivable it really is that any area of America, for any country for that matter, would be unaffected if the predicted earth changes do occur. Even if that effect isn't geological, it will surely be felt in terms of food energy, or most importantly, the emotional ties we have with other people. Most bluntly put, there is no place to go and sit out the changes. Thinking for just a moment about America, this nation has grown to the point where we are one interdependent people. The very resources with which we live our lives have come to us through a complex exchange involving countless other people. If one aspect of the whole is interrupted by an earthquake or any other catastrophe, it will be felt throughout our nation and beyond. Just imagine, for example, the impact on our food supplies if there are huge earthquakes in California. And this same principle governs the world as well. We are a world community. Isolationism is no longer an option for any country. When something occurs that disturbs the balance, then it's usually felt within days throughout the world. What does this principle of interrelationship tell us about so-called safety lands? For one thing, it makes us look very carefully at our definition of the word safety. What would Case have really meant? On the one hand, he may have been trying to identify actual areas of the continent where there would be little or no flooding or shaking. And yet, how could any spot be entirely safe? Case's own oceanfront hometown of Virginia Beach seems particularly vulnerable, even though it was mentioned several times as a safe place. If the prophecies prove to be correct, if, for example, land rises off the east coast of America, logic suggests that these upheavals would at least cause some coastal flooding. It's already happened with sub-hurricane level nor'easter storms. Earthquakes and land formation in the Atlantic would almost certainly cause destructive flooding. All this suggests that we need to look for other meanings to the phrase safety lands. To assert that there is any private safety would be inconsistent with Case's total philosophy about the Millennium. Authentic safety must fundamentally rest upon being secure spiritually. No soul is saved just because it's outside the path of material harm. Real security is an inner state. We are safe when we are right with God and when we are in alignment with the ideals that we've set. For example, in 1942, one person asked if we would be safe in his hometown of New York, that is, safe from bombing or enemy attack. Case's answer points to the deeper meaning of safety and security. Why should he not if he lives right? A new theory is needed for the concept of safety land. As we move into the new millennium, it need not contradict the literal interpretation of these words, but it should be complementary and demonstrate how the notion of safety may have multiple levels of meanings. Here's one possibility. Cities, regions, and even entire states can create by the attitudes and actions of its people a kind of group consciousness, and that collective mind and energy gives a location a particular vibration. In turn, that vibration, if it's resonant to spiritual values, can afford its people a sort of protection. This protection might be from outside threats or even disturbances of the earth, but more importantly, in times of upheaval or severe testing, it affords protection for the individual from those parts of the self that will lead to fear and doubt. That's the real threat, that we might lose faith in ourselves, our future, and our Creator. Case's readings speak in detail about such a concept of vibration for a particular location. Each state, country, or town makes its own vibrations by or through the activities of those that comprise same. Although it's hard to describe logically, this is something that most of us have intuitively felt. When we visit a new location, we can often sense or feel something intangible about that place. We can perceive its collective spirit. We might verbalize such an impression with words like, I just really feel at home here. Or when the vibration doesn't match our own, I need to get out of here, because something about this place keeps me from being myself. And so, what does all this suggest about Case's prophetic statement in 1941? What about that rather limited list of areas that will be safe from earth changes in North America? Perhaps he was identifying those areas of the country that had especially large numbers of people who were creating a vibration or aura of attunement. However, that was 1941. It's reasonable to hope and expect that since that time, many more locals in America and throughout the world have developed the status of safety lands. Even though in the future some of these places may be shaken physically, even though every one of them will feel the effects in some way if the earth changes do take place, they may nevertheless be places of special opportunity. These special locations may help people stay psychologically and spiritually safe in times of change because of the way in which, in the collective consciousness, that brings out the best in individuals in times of crisis. We don't have to move to one of the existing safe locations. We can each work to build that status for the community in which we already live.